Hello, and welcome to another episode of Anticipating CSICon 2024, my series publicizing this year's conference of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. This conference is called CSICon, and it'll take place in Las Vegas from October 24th to the 27th. Today's guest is Dr. Daniel Sy-muns, and he's one of the CSICon scheduled speakers. Welcome, Dan. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on.
So, this is an excerpt of what it says about you on the conference speaker site. Feel free to correct it afterwards. I'm not sure if you wrote it or they just pulled the information from your Wikipedia site. It says, Daniel Sy-muns is a professor of psychology, advertising, and business administration at the University of Illinois, where he heads the Visual Cognition Laboratory. His research explores the limits of awareness and memory, the reasons we often are unaware of those limits, and the implications of such limits for our personal and professional lives. He is best known for his research that shows people are far less aware of their visual surroundings than they think they are.
Sounds accurate.
Okay, good.
Sounds familiar too.
Well, I know about a few things that are missing from that bio. Your books, for one thing, right? I see 3 books when I looked online. Nobody's Fool, your latest. We can talk about that in some detail later. The Invisible Gorilla, which just is an amazing phenomenon. We'll talk about the details of that. And your first one, Change, Blindness, and Visual Memory.
Yeah, and that was an edited book, a collection of articles from a special issue of a journal. So it's not quite the same kind of book. Most people aren't going to want to rush out and buy that one.
And of all the people I've interviewed for this now being my 3rd year of interviewing speakers for CSICon and others, you are the very first person I've ever interviewed that is a winner of the Ig Nobel Prize.
That's actually surprising. I would have thought that there'd be more.
Or maybe it just never came up and they didn't want to say it. I don't know. It wasn't in their bio. It wasn't on their Wikipedia page. But yours is prominent, so I want
Absolutely.
So tell people what that is. What is the Ig Nobel Prize?
So the Ig Nobel Prize, as distinct from the Nobel Prize, is an award for science or findings that first make you laugh and then make you think. So the early Ig Nobels were more sort of mocking in character, but now they're much more about science and scientists who maybe don't take themselves too seriously, who are willing to sort of laugh at what they do. And, Chris Chabris and I got that one for a study in which we had somebody in a gorilla suit in a video. So we knew going in that had humor value, but that was the point, right? It was to make it something so ridiculous that people would comment on it if they saw it.
So if people don't know about this, they're going to go, what? So let me read what it says on the Ig Nobel site. It says, this is for psychology. Actual Daniel Sy-muns of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and Christopher Chabris of Harvard University for demonstrating that when people pay close attention to something, it's all too easy to overlook anything else, even a woman in a gorilla suit.
Exactly, yeah.
So for people who don't know about this, and now we're going to ruin it for someone who sees it the first time, because the point is you're not supposed to know about the gorilla suit. But let them know about what this video is about.
Yeah, so it's actually a really fairly simple task that's just kind of strange. And it was a study that we modeled on much earlier work by my colleague Dick Neisser. So we were just trying to replicate and extend his work. But what we did was had people watch a video, and we had 3 people wearing white T-shirts passing a ball to each other. And your task was just to count how many times they complete a pass. And we made it harder by also having 3 people wearing black shirts passing their own ball, and you were supposed to ignore their passes.
So you had to pay attention to something and on the same visual field, ignore the other thing.
Exactly. It's all in this overlapping same shot, single video. And remarkably, we can actually do this really well. This is not a trivial thing. If you try and design a computer vision system that would accurately count the passes from one set of players and ignore the others, it's not a trivial thing to do. But we can do it really well. Even young kids can do that really well. But while you're doing this task and focusing on some aspects of the world and not on others, you can miss fairly surprising things. So in that case, we had a woman wearing a full-body gorilla suit, walk into the middle of the scene, turn and face the camera, thump her chest, and then walk off the other side, visible for about 8 seconds or so. And we find that about half the time, half the people don't see it. And it went viral, I think, because of that 50% thing. It's like any sort of ambiguous figure where some people see it one way, other people see it another way, and you get together in the same room and you can't believe the other person's seeing it wrong. Well, this has that same sort of character. If you're in the room with somebody who sees it, they can't imagine that possibly you could have missed it. And if you missed it, you don't believe that they actually saw it. Right?
This
So it's
happened with the dress also, right?
mhm.
I witnessed people screaming about that when it first came out. And also,
Yeah.
oh, now I can't think of the word. There was an audio track which people heard one way versus another way.
Yeah, it was
And
the
I saw this in a,
Yanni. Yeah, I forget which one it was. Yanni.
yes, yeah, yes.
Yeah,
Yanni was one of the words. Laurel,
yeah,
Laurel
yeah.
and
Laurel
Yanni.
and Yanni. Yeah, yeah,
I worked in an environment where it was open group and I saw people yell, "You're lying to me. There's no way you could hear that wrong."
yeah. And I think that's the sort of character for a lot of these effects that kind of take off on their own, is that you can get people experiencing the same world in a different way. And it's a really compelling thing to experience when you just fail to see something that other people think is completely obvious. Right? And that's one of the key themes in a lot of what I talk about and what I write about, is that our intuitions about these sorts of things, about what we'll notice and what we won't notice, tend to be misguided because we're focusing only on the information we have and not the information we don't. So if I were to show you that video and you're one of the 50% who didn't happen to see the gorilla, and I never ask you about a gorilla, you'll continue to go through life assuming that, of course, you would notice if a person in a video walked in and thumped their chest and walked off the other side, because it's obvious, right? Um,
But
so if you continue to go through life based on your experiences, what you have seen and what you haven't seen, you're aware of all of those unexpected events you happen to notice. You're unaware of all the ones you miss. So you go through life thinking you, of course, notice unexpected things. It leads to this sort of mistaken belief about how our minds work.
are there people who, after watching it, who are in the 50% who didn't see the gorilla, and then you tell them about that and you show them a video again, do they say that's a different video?
When we did the original study, it was actually with video cassettes. So we would literally physically rewind the video with them watching it so they could see that it was exactly the same video. And we still occasionally have people think, oh, well, you just switched the tape. Right? And it's so compelling. Our intuition is so strong that we notice things that are important and unexpected that it's really hard to overcome, right? Because it is obvious. That was the point. We picked something that was so obvious that if you saw it, you would immediately say, wait a second, there's a gorilla there. And it makes it that much more compelling when you think you will and you don't. There's another variant of this we haven't actually done, but show people a video that doesn't have a gorilla and try and convince them that they missed one. But people don't tend to mistakenly say they saw things that they didn't, though. So,
Ooh, Elizabeth Loftus, who I've interviewed on recovered memories,
yep,
false memories, right? There are tests which show, which she
yep,
did, I recall her mentioning, showed people, I think it was like photoshopped pictures from their childhood, some of which
yeah,
were real and some
absolutely.
weren't. And you can get a significant portion of people to believe, oh yeah, I went on a hot air balloon with my parents and they never did, just because they saw.
Yeah, absolutely. You can get people to misremember details of what happened in the past. We don't tend to spontaneously say in the moment that we saw something that we didn't in that sort of short-term case. You can, through suggestions, through photographs, through doctoring imagery, get people to believe things that didn't actually happen. And that's quite common.
So the first time I was shown the video of the gorilla, I unfortunately had been told there's a gorilla, so I saw the gorilla. But then there was another time I came across a video by someone else, maybe it was yours, doing it. And they go, "Oh, did you see the gorilla?" And they show the gorilla, and they said, "But I'll bet you didn't see this." And
Yeah,
there was something else.
that was the sequel. Yeah.
That was like, that got me, totally
Yep.
got me.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the intent, right? It was to see.
Yeah, and I won't say what that
Yeah.
is in case someone
Yep.
comes across it.
Yeah. That
But
makes
yes,
sense.
that was great. So is that demonstrating? I get these two confused. Change blindness, or is it inattentional blindness?
That one's inattentional blindness. So the distinction between the two comes to, they're both very closely related, and I've studied both a lot. But change blindness is a failure to notice that something is different from one moment to the next. So you've got a scene, you take it away, and then you present a changed version of it. Or you're watching a movie and there's an editing mistake. So somebody uneats a Twinkie, right, in the movie from one moment to the next. That sort of editing mistake, if you fail to notice it, would be because of change blindness. You notice the Twinkie before, you don't notice that it's changed afterwards. And if you notice it, you're doing change detection.
Okay, so the
So
Wrath of Khan, I think it was, Kirk's flap was down, and then the very next
yeah,
scene, just a camera switch, same time frame, it was up.
yep, yeah,
Some people
and
I know
that's
didn't notice that until it was all over,
yeah,
being.
absolutely. And there are people who spend their careers pointing out film flubs like that. And they're commonplace. Every major movie has some continuity errors like that because it's impossible to catch all of them. And editors also don't use that as the primary criterion for deciding which scene to use. If they've got a fantastic performance by an actor in a scene that happens to have a mistake, as compared to one that was kind of a less good performance, one that didn't have a mistake, they're going to go with the one where the actor did well. So there are those sorts of mistakes in every movie.
And by previous experience, they probably realize what we're talking about, that most people aren't going to notice it anyway.
That's right. In fact, there are people whose job it is on set to track whether or not there are mistakes in those sorts of movies. So their job is to make sure there is continuity. They're known as script supervisors. And I've actually interviewed a few of these script supervisors about how they learn to do what they do and whether they just have a great visual memory. And their response is, yeah, not really. I might have a slightly better visual memory than other people, but what they have that's really different is they have good metacognition. They know that their memory is fallible. They know that they won't remember details precisely. So they'll check. And they'll say things like, I could have sworn to you that this person was carrying their life jacket on their right arm. I would have bet money on it, but it was actually on their left. And when I went back and looked at the video, I realized I was wrong. So they have that experience of missing the gorilla and then realizing that they missed it over and over again. They realize that they've seen something incorrectly or remembered something incorrectly. They check it against the real record. And then they recognize, oh, I misremembered that. That must have been a problem. Most of us don't have that. Most of us don't get that experience of having our memories checked or being questioned about something we just missed as a regular experience. So we build up this belief that whatever we're doing, no matter how intently we're focusing on something, if something else important happens, we'll notice it.
So the other thing is the change blindness. So
yeah,
I've seen experiments on shows like Brain Games, I think it is,
mm-hmm.
and other YouTube videos where this is done. So this would be like you go over to somebody at a counter at a register,
Yep.
and you have a little conversation with them, and that person's a plant,
Mm-hmm.
and they pretend to drop something behind the counter, and they pop up, and it's a different person wearing a hat where the other
Yep.
person didn't have a hat, glasses, no glass, and the people just carry on the conversation like nothing happened.
That's change blindness. Yep. Yeah, that was I did that with Brain Games some years ago, and it was fun because we did it in a casino, and they would just grab people off the casino floor, and a lot of people on the casino floor had been drinking, so we got some really interesting reactions. I don't think any of those made it into the show.
So all of this brings into great question, the jury system in the United States and our
Mm-hmm.
trial system. I was called for jury duty, and I got dismissed when I told them I was a skeptic. Had interviewed Elizabeth Loftus after the judge said this may come down to eyewitness testimony, and it
Yep.
was something that happened 8 years ago. And I said I'm not going to convict somebody of a crime based on eyewitness testimony of one person. And she was like flabbergasted, like no one
Yeah.
else would say that. It's like.
Yeah, it's
So
probably unusual for a juror to tell them that. Yeah. But the court system have been getting a lot better about recognizing the fallibility of eyewitness testimony. And the sorts of studies that Beth Loftus has done over the years and these studies of change blindness suggest that our memory from one moment to the next can be fallible. Right? We can not recognize that the person we were talking to a minute earlier is now a different person. So I agree with you that in many cases, you want to be really wary about relying entirely on eyewitness testimony, especially when the initial identification lacks confidence and lacks certainty. So the vast majority of cases where somebody was convicted based on eyewitness testimony, by testimony of identification of a witness, the vast majority of those cases that later were overturned as a result of DNA evidence or other sorts of evidence, vast majority of them had an initial identification that was not confident. So the witness said, yeah, I think that's them, but I'm really not sure. And then later became confident by the time they were testifying in court, which is an easy thing to have happen for exactly the sorts of reasons that Beth Loftus has talked about, that repeating the memory over and over again, retelling it, testifying over and over again can lead to greater confidence and certainty without actually repeatedly telling the same narrative over and over again, repeatedly talking about your memory, repeatedly recalling it can sort of make it seem more certain in your mind. So there's pretty good evidence that when somebody confidently identifies somebody at the moment, right then, said, yeah, that's the person, I just saw them do it. That's pretty accurate. It's just when it's not very confident, when it's uncertain, that it can morph over time into a certain memory where they can sit on the witness stand and say, that's them, I see them right there, I'm sure of it. And that's where you get the problems.
There was an episode of Brain Games I recall where there was a fake crime committed in front of people who were gathered together supposedly to go into a building for a
Mhm.
test. And they didn't know what they were being tested for, but in fact, it was to recall what
Mhm.
they saw as somebody grabbed somebody's purse and threw it to somebody else, and they both ran,
Mhm.
something like that, right?
Yeah.
You're aware of this one?
Yeah, yeah, it's a famous sort of classic. It used to be a classroom demonstration that we would do all the time. Have somebody come in and grab something off the desk. We can't do it anymore because it's too risky.
Because like
You know,
somebody might jump and try to stop the perpetrator.
yeah, or depending on where you live, pull a gun.
Oh,
So, yeah, it's just not worth the risks
yeah,
anymore.
that could
But
go badly. I could see that.
yeah, yeah.
So in that study, for people who haven't seen that, the people are all taken separately and interviewed about what happened, what color were the clothing the
Mhm.
people were wearing, everything is different. And then there was a plant who was purposely, then they were put together and
Mhm.
no, you think it was a white dress, it was a yellow dress. And the person's convinced to change their mind that it's a yellow dress.
Yeah.
And then, like before we were talking about, at the end, they're all gathered and told what really went on, and they showed the recording made, and they go, no, that's not what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, people can become very certain of things that are actually not true. As we all know from sort of skeptical thinking, right? A lot of facts don't necessarily stick, and it's really easy to become dissuaded by information that's deceptive, right? Information that's wrong.
So what are the other real world applications of this knowledge and getting out into the world besides, the criminal justice system?
I think for change blindness, that's the most natural case. So change blindness is this failure of memory. We don't precisely realize that something's different from how it was a moment ago, or we misremember details from one moment to the next. Inattentional blindness, which is a failure to notice something that's right there in front of you, fully obvious. You don't have to rely on memory at all. It's a gorilla in plain sight. Inattentional blindness, I think, has more ramifications in contexts like driving, where we often assume that if something unexpected happens, we'll notice it and react to it. So much so that we do things like talk on phones while driving, which diminishes our ability to notice other things. So we tend to think that talking on a phone while driving, well, those are so different, right? Driving requires your hands and you're staring at the road, and talking is just a conversation. But we don't realize that they use the same cognitive abilities. They use the same attention capacity. So when you're talking on a phone, your driving's impaired. When you're driving, you're talking, your conversation's actually impaired. So you can't really truly multitask in that way. It's a bit like whistling and chewing gum and talking at the same time. You just can't do it because it all uses your mouth in conflicting ways. Well, the same is true with attention. If it uses the same sort of cognitive mechanisms in the same ways, you get problems.
This is why I actually always caution people, in my life not to do that, because I
Yep.
remember I'm old enough to remember when they first started implementing, when there were cell phones, and okay, no, you got to be hands free because that's the
Yep.
safe thing to do. And it's like,
Yep.
no, that may be a part of the problem if somebody's holding
Yeah.
a phone to their head, but the other part is what you're talking about, and that was never captured. It's
Yeah.
like, and there's no law about not talking on a phone as long as you're not holding it in your hand.
Yeah, well, back in the day when these laws were first starting to be passed, it was actually just before 9/11. There was a lot of movement to pass anti-cell phone laws for driving. And in New York State, which was one of the first laws passed, the biggest lobbyists in favor of the law were the cell phone companies. And they were advocating for banning hands-free but not handheld phones. And of course, they made a lot of money from hands-free headsets. So
Right.
it was it was not based on the science at the time, which showed that it didn't really matter if it was handheld or hand-free.
Has there been
Um,
any movement on that? I imagine it would be
no,
virtually impossible to try to ban you talking on a phone at all.
it's almost impossible,
Right.
especially now that the systems are all integrated into the cars
Right. How would
themselves. So
you even
you
know
can't even
someone was
tell.
doing that? Right.
Yeah, and I think it reveals another sort of intuition mistake that we make, which is that going harkening way back to the 80s when there were movements to ban driving and drinking, right? You'd regularly hear this response from people who didn't want those bans to say, well, I can drive just fine after a few beers. It's just other people can't do it, but I'm fine. Like, well, why do you have that intuition? Well, when you're intoxicated, most of the time you're going to get home safely. Most of the time you're not going to be in a collision. And that reinforces your belief that you can do it just fine. but you're also impaired, which means you don't notice how poorly you're driving. And the same is true for cell phones. People who are talking on a phone are distracted. Because they're distracted, they don't realize that they're driving poorly. And everybody's had that experience of watching somebody else talking on a phone and running a stop sign or weaving across lanes. And many of them still think, well, I can do it just fine. It's just that they're bad at it.
Okay, so as I was talking about your books, I
Mhm.
mentioned Nobody's Fool is your latest. Can you tell the viewers what that one is about?
Yeah, so Nobody's Fool is about the cognitive mechanisms, the reasons why we can be deceived or scammed or fooled. So Invisible Gorilla was about how our intuitions about our own minds are often misled or misleading and for completely rational reasons. So we have strong intuitions, they're based on our experiences, and our experiences can be deceptive. Nobody's Fool is about how con artists or scammers or people looking to deceive us can take advantage of the sort of cognitive tendencies we have, the habits, the kinds of information we find appealing, and use those to, and kind of hijack those to take advantage of us. So the things that we do that most of the time serve us really, really well can be co-opted to take advantage of us. And the goal of the book is to sort of identify what are these sort of cognitive characteristics, how are they consistent across all of the ways that people deceive us, and what can we do to sort of notice when that might be happening and to try and stem it, cut it off before it gets too bad.
Could you give me an example of some of the things the book talks about specifically?
One of the things we talk about in the book are what we call habits. And these are just our cognitive tendencies, the way we process the world, that most of the time are great, most of the time serve us really well. And because they serve us well, they constitute shortcuts. They constitute ways of not necessarily doing all of the deliberation we would want to do if we thought we were being deceived. So we spend a lot of time kind of doing things in a way that's really efficient and useful. And those efficiencies can be hijacked by somebody looking to deceive us. So take the example of familiarity. So when you know somebody well, right, when they're familiar to you, you tend to trust them. And that makes a lot of sense. When you've had friends for years, you kind of know what they're about. You know whether they're likely to lie to you or not. And we tend to stick around people who don't lie to us. So familiar things tend to be more trustworthy. Things that we've experienced a lot tend to be more trustworthy. We know them better. We have a sense that they're okay. But we can be deceived if we mistake that sort of genuine familiarity from more superficial familiarity. So if you take the case of, say, Bernie Madoff, con artist, Ponzi schemer, Madoff, in many ways, his Ponzi scheme capitalized on affinity. So he capitalized on familiarity with particular groups of victims. So he didn't target people who lived everywhere in the country. He didn't target the whole world. He targeted people who were in New York or Florida, who were somewhat savvy investors, who shared some of the same social groups and religious groups he did, same philanthropic groups. He targeted people who knew him or knew what he was about and relied on that familiarity to get people to trust it, to the extent that people thought they knew him much better than they actually did. So there are cases of people being warned that his investments were a scam and saying, well, no, Bernie would never screw me. Right? They were so confident that they knew him because he was familiar in these important ways. And that sort of familiarity can play a lot of roles. So I think it's one of the big factors leading to spread of social media, disinformation and misinformation. We have tons of friends on social media who we might barely know. They're more acquaintances. But because we interact with them in this sort of mediated experience, they become familiar to us. We feel like we know them. It's why people feel like they know actors, even though they've never met them. We get this sense of, I know this person, I know what they're like.
Gwyneth Paltrow would never sell me anything that doesn't work. I loved her
Yeah.
in the Avengers films.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So people develop the sense of trust because of what they read as that person. It's why advertising using celebrities is something that's kind of effective. It's you have an affinity for them. So when Shaq tells you to buy crypto, it's like, well, I like Shaq. He seems like a straightforward guy. Maybe he's telling you the truth. So we have this tendency not to be as questioning of things that are familiar to us to begin with. And
Right.
con artists use that as an entry point. There are many other sorts of things that con artists use. One of the other ones is efficiency. So people like to be efficient. They like to get things done without having to work too much. And con artists, of course, rely on us not asking additional questions. And they make it hard to ask additional questions. And that sort of tendency to not ask questions can lead us to be scammed very easily.
By the way, inattentional blindness, I hadn't really paid any attention to your background for the last however long. Now, and now I see you have not only gorilla and gorilla photo, but let's see, what is the horse? Oh, that's the cover of your latest book.
That's Trojan horse. Yeah. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
only, it only took me 20 minutes to notice that in your back.
You might be the first person who's actually commented on it.
Okay, so let's talk
Yeah.
about your CSICon talk. Your presentation has been titled Out of Focus.
Mhm.
You're scheduled to talk on Saturday at 3
Mhm.
o'clock for an hour, by the way. That's premier. I don't think anyone but Neil deGrasse Tyson and Brian Cox are getting that much time, but that's amazing. Everyone else is a half hour.
Oh,
So that's fantastic.
yeah,
Can you
that should
tell
be
us
fun.
specifically what your talk is going to cover?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about the limits of attention and how attention works. Some of the topics we've talked about a little bit here, but I'll go into a little more depth, talking about how we perceive the world and how we think we perceive the world and how that's related to the focus of our attention, how easily we can fail to see things that fall outside of our focus, that are out of that focus. And why that matters, because we think we understand what we're going to see. We think we know what we're going to see, and we're remarkably good at focusing. It's really an important skill, right? I mentioned earlier that people can do that counting task with the basketballs really easily. And that's a tremendously important ability. If we were perpetually distracted by everything that was not of interest to us, we couldn't get anything done. So our ability to focus is an essential skill, but it can lead to mistaken beliefs. And some of those mistaken beliefs have to do with how our mind works. And some of those mistaken beliefs can lead to us being fooled and deceived. So the first substantive chapter of our book is titled Focus. And it's about thinking about the information we don't have, the information that's not in front of us, and how when we select what we pay attention to and select the information that we get, or when somebody gives us information that we then focus on, we can miss the critical things. We can miss the information we actually need to make the right choices.
So is this your first appearance at a CSICon?
It is, yeah. I've talked to skeptic groups and some podcasts, but I haven't been at CSICon before. So I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, so that was my next question. What other skeptical groups have you talked to? Other conferences, or is it local groups?
Mostly some local groups, and I've done a couple of podcasts over the years with skeptic societies and skeptic groups, but not I haven't been to the conferences, so I'm really looking forward to it.
One of the earliest things of this memory issue that I remember was I was listening to the three brothers, the novellas, talk about Pompeii, because something had been uncovered in Pompeii recently. And the younger brother, Jay, said, "Yeah, I remember being there, and you could see the dead people lying there, the covered in it." And then the older, "You never came with us, Jay. That was you're remembering Mom telling us that story because we went as little children, but you didn't come." And he was like astounded.
Yeah. Yeah, it's this illusion of memory that you can feel like you remember something so vividly. When we were writing Invisible Gorilla many years ago, we did a little memory test on ourselves. So I wrote down exactly what I was doing, where I was, who I was with when I first heard about the attacks on September 11th, and wrote it out as about a page and a half, detailing everything that happened from the moments before I heard about it until I left for the day. And I wrote a lot of detail. I remembered being in my lab at Harvard, and that was right. I was actually in my office. And I remembered my three graduate students being there. All of them are named Steve, so I remembered the three Steves all being there. It was a fluky thing. I don't know. But yeah, all three Steves, I remembered being there, and I remembered kind of going into another person's room and watching one of the things, looking for images on their computer, and then we set up a television in the lab and tried to watch a little bit, and then eventually I left and went home. I went to pick up my wife at downtown Boston and went home. And then, before I showed that summary to anybody else, I wrote to the three Steves and had them do the same thing. Recall everything that they remembered from that day without talking to anybody else about it. And it turns out that 2 of the 3 weren't there. One of them was across campus giving a talk and had documentation of that. And the other one was asleep, which was much more in character for that time of day. And they both remembered that another person actually had been in the room with me the entire time, and I didn't remember them being there. And that was a postdoc who had been in the lab for that 1 year. And he apparently had been in my office having a meeting, and I have no memory of him being there at all.
So, who's right in this case? Were you right?
I was wrong. I'm pretty sure because of the converging evidence from from the 3 Steves and from the person who I didn't remember.
So they didn't share information before they talked to you?
Nope, not at all. Okay, yeah. Okay. So that was the idea. So everybody independently recalls what they experienced, and then that's a way of sort of validating whether or not there's a chance that somebody's misremembering something, and sometimes to identify who is. So I know that I am not remembering correctly that the 2 of the 3 Steves were there when they weren't, and I misremembered that Michael wasn't there. And it's a really powerful feeling. We rarely do this. And that's one of the interesting things about that illusion of memory, is that we think we remember things when we remember it like a video, when it plays back, when you saw those bodies in Pompeii in your mind's eye. It's really hard to imagine that that could be false, that it could be a distortion that came from hearing the story of it many, many times and incorporating it into your own thinking. And part of the reason why we find it so hard to believe that it could be wrong is that we never check. We don't actually go back to that documentary evidence. There are very few people who get that experience of checking. Right? One is people in that sort of situation where you get a direct conflict. The only other group that has this happen to them a lot is politicians, because politicians routinely are talking about their past, and they have journalists checking out their histories. And I've got a kind of sort of stock op-ed that you could submit for any election season. Doesn't matter which party, doesn't matter which politician. There's going to be in every major election season somebody who misremembers something about their past, or misrepresents it, or aggrandizes it, right? And the stories always get bigger, right? It's the fish gets bigger in the retelling. That's a common trait of how our memories work. I think one of my favorite examples of how this can happen is the Mandela effect. And probably a lot of people in the skeptic community and CSICon have heard this many times, but the Mandela effect is this idea that I remember something in a particular way. So the original was, I remember Mandela dying in prison as a political prisoner, basically, which he didn't, right? He got out of prison and became president of South Africa.
So you say, Dan.
Yeah. But that's exactly it, right? People have this memory. Right. Other people have the same mistaken memory.
And you just don't realize the whole universe changed around you. You don't realize
exactly.
That. I do.
Right. In order to have that sort of belief that the universe has changed, you have to be so committed to the idea that your memory can't be wrong. Right. And commitment is another of the sorts of habits that we talk about a lot. Is that when you commit to something, when an assumption becomes so strongly held that you don't question it anymore, it can lead to all sorts of sort of nonsensical thinking. And I think there's a danger in looking at people who believe in things like the Mandela effect, right, and believe that their memories are right and the world has changed, and saying, oh, well, they must be clueless, or they must have something wrong in their head, or they're just kind of, they're gullible or silly. And that's not the right way to think about these sorts of things. People get immersed into a belief system because of a commitment they held. But once you give them that commitment, all of the logical reasoning follows naturally from it, right? If you commit to the idea that memory is infallible, it cannot change, it can't be wrong, well, then how do you explain things? You have to go through a bunch of logical hoops to make it work, but it's not necessarily that they're being irrational. It's just that they're starting with a bad premise. And a lot of sort of the mistaken reasoning that we see, a lot of the reason people kind of end up down in these sort of conspiratorial rabbit holes is starting with a premise that's wrong, getting absolutely committed to it, and then reasoning completely rationally all the way from there. It can explain some of the cult beliefs. If you believe that the cult leader is infallible and a genius and that you should follow everything they say, well, then all of those inconsistencies in their actions and their crazy claims have to be made consistent with that premise. And we will jump through great hoops to do that. One of the other speakers at CSICon, David McRaney, will probably be talking about exactly how difficult it is to pull somebody out of out of their belief system, because changing somebody's mind requires doing that. It requires getting all the way back up to those original commitments and then somehow breaking free from them. And that's not an easy thing to do.
I have to make that talk. So besides him, who else are you looking forward to meeting for the first time at the conference?
Oh, there's so many people. Like Chris French, I haven't met, but I have lots of friends in common, and he's done some work on inattentional blindness too that I'd like to talk to him about. And I know Susan Gerbich's gonna be there, and talked about, we talk a lot about a little bit about psychics in our book and how they use focus actually. So the idea of how they take advantage of people and the concept of grief vampires is really compelling. So lots of people. I mean, I'm looking forward to it a lot.
Excellent. I hope you're staying for Sunday. And people watching this, if you're coming to CSICon, stay for the Sunday Papers Talk. Actually, Susan Garbik and I are the moderators of that event this year. So we have 6 speakers on a variety of skeptical topics.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, because it's Sunday morning, a lot of
Yeah.
people leave right then and miss it. If they just got a later flight, they
Yeah.
catch.
I'm hoping I can be there for
great
part
talk.
of it. I think my flight has to leave midday because coming back toward the East Coast is harder. But yeah,
Okay,
I'm hoping
so
to
I think
catch it.
this is a good place to wrap it up. Thanks again for your time. And
Sure
how
thing.
can people best follow your work?
I'm easy to find. So just dansymonds.com is probably the best starting spot.
Okay, thanks again for joining me today, and I'm looking forward to meeting you in real life in Vegas.
I am looking forward to meeting you as well.
So I used this opportunity to conduct a small experiment of my own. How many people watching this video noticed that I had on a different shirt at the beginning introduction section and I was not wearing glasses? If you did not notice, that's an example of change blindness. Thank you for participating. Let me know in the comments if you noticed that or didn't.